All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be answering questions from the Patreon. Lots of gems, lots of squatting while you're in the fight, lots of, dude, if you do the Sunim Tao the right way, no one will ever take you down, bro. Let's get to it!
And every day, I practice martial arts.
Yo, Dre, how you doing, man?
Sifu, it's your birthday. What's
it was
going
my
on?
birthday. Thank you,
What's
thank you,
going
thank
on?
you.
Happy birthday
well,
out here.
You can see, as our longtime viewers probably know from previous years, every year for my birthday, since before we started the podcast, like just shortly
Like
before,
right before.
you have made a custom KFG shirt for my birthday. It's got the KFG kick logo in the front. On the back, it's like the 1111 series. And every year you do it in a different color and you give it to the crew. So me, you, Mikey, a couple other people get it as well. I remember the first year was black with gold.
Black with gold.
Right?
That's what I was wondering. What was the first?
Then we did, or I should say you did the red with the yellow.
Red with yellow.
And then was the
Blue with red.
Blue with red. So anyway, this
Dead
year
ass,
we
eh?
got kind of like the camo green going on, which is pretty dope. You got yours. I got mine. So
Mikey has hit.
yeah, we don't sell these, but people ask about them all the time. We should maybe sell the different series like this way. It would be totally dope, right? But yeah, so I did on my birthday. It's over a week ago, I guess now. And yeah,
What'd you
thank
do for your birthday?
Went out with a bunch of students and my girls. Anyway, here we are for another episode. We are winding down our season 4, and as I've discussed both in the community section on YouTube and on the podcast, we're going to be kind of switching it up a little bit for season 5. I really want to get back to kind of the stuff that I've really like to do best, which is the Wing Chun stuff for our supporters, whether they're on YouTube or Patreon, and do kind of the types of topics that really hit on YouTube, like the Bruce Lee stuff, Kung Fu stuff, but in a more deep dive kind of way. So I think that for season 5, I want to have more interviews because I really quite enjoy doing interviews. It also takes the heat off of me because I can just sit and listen.
All right, so you're going deep like the abyss. I like it.
Yes, and on top of that, I want to do like deeper dives into various topics, and I want to do more Wing Chun stuff for our Patreon supporters, which, by the way, the best way to support the Kung Fu Genius is on Patreon. Patreon.com/the Kung Fu Genius for all your Kung Fu Genius needs. For as little as $5 a month, you can support your favorite Kung Fu podcast out of New York with the most manliest of co-hosts. Higher tiers of support get access to all sorts of goodies, and we have like reels and all sorts of cool things. I also do special AMA episodes just for our Patreon and our YouTube members here, because if you don't want to support us on Patreon, you can support us right here on YouTube. All that information is in the description below. So, speaking of Patreon supporters, today's topic comes from one of our Patreon supporters.
That is right.
And usually what I do is I take questions from the Patreons, and I'll do like kind of a private AMA for them, which doesn't go on YouTube, although I do release individual questions for the members on YouTube. For the paid members, but this question I thought was pretty decent and could make a good topic for a regular episode for everyone else. So go ahead and read that off, Trey.
We have Chris O.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh. Jeez.
Hey, KFG, does WT have breakfalls, rolls, and get-up techniques? Ooh, good. Also, what is that thing in the Ip Man movie where Donnie was squatting with one leg forward with Mansao?
In the fighting position, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like
a lot of people ask me about that.
Did that in the ring last fight?
No, that was I believe that was Yip Man 3, and that was when he was fighting Mike Tyson. All right, another historically accurate part of the Yip Man movie franchise.
Remember.
So yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting that I get questions about that a lot, which is weird because this is I think what's happened partially because of social media, and there's a blurring of
Love
the
social
lines.
media.
Yeah, there's a blurring of the lines between like movie Wing Chun and then what actual Wing Chun is. So you have like these people like that Tao Tang Yu or whatever on Instagram who's basically doing Wing Chun choreography, but everyone thinks he's like some famous master from China. but he's like just a social media invention, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a blurring of like, oh, what that guy is doing versus like what Donnie Yen does in the IP Man movies. And then as someone who teaches Wing Chun professionally,
Mm.
I get asked questions about that stuff as if that is somehow like legitimate Wing Chun.
It's totally spectacular.
Yeah, and it's funny because like obviously people know, well, the movies are movies, and um martial arts in the real world are different from how they're portrayed in the films. Like people get that, but they still also don't.
Mm.
They'll still ask me like, so is that a thing in Wing Chun? Like doing a pistol leg squat in the middle of a fight where you're about to go toe to toe with one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time. And so clearly, fake Paul didn't need that to beat Mike
No.
Tyson, right? He didn't need to squat in the middle of the
No,
fight.
all he needed
Although
was
he
a
might
great
as well
contract.
have, that fight was so ridiculous. Right? He might as well have done that. That would have been a great nod. Can you imagine if Jake Paul just like did the single leg squat,
Oh,
put his hand like that, and then proceeded to use Wing Chun to beat up Mike Tyson in that rig fight?
Tyson would have loved it.
Yeah, it would have been amazing.
My
Um,
God, he's in Wing Chun.
Jesus. So the weird thing is that like people still don't really seem to understand the difference between like the movie stuff and the real stuff, because I get asked all the time about like, well, what about this thing in the movie? And I go, yeah, it's like a thing in a movie. It's like nothing to do with like the as far as the Yip Man franchise goes, uh, the first one is clearly the best one.
Yeah.
People get a bit of a hard on for the second one. I think the second one sucks because the second one just looks like a kind of the elements of like kind of Rocky 4 that are in there, like with the fight versus like the Westerner and the ring and everything like that. It just feels very like an exploitative Yip Man movie, but everyone likes it, I guess, because it's when Yip Man comes to Hong Kong. I don't know. I'm in the minority, and I know this because a lot of people really think that the second Yip Man movie is the best. I had a hard time sitting through it, but that's because I'm a Yip Man and Wing Chun nerd.
It's also because you don't really like Sammo Hung either.
I love Sammo Hung. What are you talking about? All right. No spoilers, by the way. But the problem is, I just saw it as like a really cheap sequel to the first one, because the first one, while it's not at all like historically accurate, it treaded over a part of Yip Man's story that we don't know that much about, namely his time before he came to Hong Kong.
That Yip Man 2 was the one where they had scene, right, on the table.
Yes.
They fought on a big round table. Okay.
Yes. And so when you look at that compared to Yip Man 1, now, of course, Yip Man 1 also has its unrealistic elements,
Oh, yeah.
like Yip Man versus the 10 black belts. But if you look at that fight choreography,
It's so cool, though.
it is great. It's a great fight. And it is kind of like Donnie's nod to Bruce Lee's, Fist of Fury, right? But it's very hard hitting and it's very brutal.
Ooh, so brutal.
But you still kind of have a feeling it's grounded in somewhat of a reality. Now, when you get to the final fight scene, spoilers, there's some, hokey stuff where he's about to like fall off the platform and he kind of saves himself. Like you can see there's like some wire stuff going on or whatever. I guess they had to pull out some of that for the final fight. But the rest of the fights were kind of a little more not really grounded in reality as we know it, but in that universe. No one is flying. No one is doing anything really fantastical. But then the whole fight scene in Yip Man 2 on like the tables and stuff, that starts to border on like, okay, now we're getting back into wire fu again, right? And so for me, I just don't like it. I think it's kind of like when you watch Batman. I like Batman movies that are grounded in like a realistic world. I like, for example, like what they did with all like the latest attempt at DC, not like the Batman, I mean like the Justice League stuff and the Flash. You don't want like Batman for me doesn't make sense fighting space aliens. I want to see like Batman going after like grounded criminals and doing detective work. That's where he shines. Yip Man, Wing Chun, Hong Kong. I want to see like more grounded fight scenes that are like more gritty and more street. I don't want to see fantastical flipping, like wire fu Yip Man. You know what I mean? So I think that's why for me, I just didn't like part
Screwed it
2.
up for you.
But every Yip Man movie that has come out since has just gotten way more ridiculous, right?
Out of pocket.
Yeah, and so then finally you get to IP Man 3, and he's having this fight with Mike Tyson for
He's a
hashtag
drug
reasons.
lord, right?
No, he's like some kind of weird landlord or some landowner or something like that, right?
What?
And then for whatever reason, Donnie Yen inexplicably gets into a pistol squat in the middle of the fight. Now, I guess it's like kind of what can I say about that? Like, yeah, first of all, a pistol squat.
Do
if
they
you've never-
call it pistol squat because it looks like a pistol
Uh,
from side?
I
profile?
suppose because like you have your leg out like
Yeah.
this or whatever, right? And because you have to keep your leg straight in order to go all the way down on one leg, right?
Okay.
Unless you can bring it to the side, which is just even more badassery, right?
Shit, you do.
But yeah, but but the single leg squat is it's a test of strength and also hip, knee, and ankle mobility as well. You can't just you have to be strong, but you also have to have like the mobility and you have to be able to handle
Gotta have
those
them hips.
angles
Hips
to
don't
the
lie.
joints. Yes. So why you would do one of the most exhausting styles of leg strength training in the middle of a fight? It would be like in the middle of the fight, you just like stop and you go to do your like PR on a bench press.
Hold on,
a
let me
few
show
times
you
and you go, okay,
my leg
now
strength
I'm
before we
ready to
fight.
fight. Yeah,
Yeah.
now I'm ready to fight. Now that I've exhausted
Yeah.
myself, right? So besides the spectacle of it, I mean, no, that's not a Wing Chun thing to drop down on one leg and go into the Zhongsa or whatever. The funny thing is that has been memeified. There's so many like they've taken that and turned it into a meme, which is like they have like the when you're on the toilet and someone tries to open the door, like so you're there with the one leg, right? so I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes
Nice.
sense. That's actually funny.
Okay.
Now the interesting thing is that is pretty ridiculous, but obviously it's there for some effects, and I still probably would bet that Donnie was actually on a wire when he did that. I don't think that he did it raw or real. I think
That
he was,
wasn't
but
raw pistol.
at his age, he can still get in that position, right? I think he was most likely assisted by something, right?
Interesting.
But either way, does that make sense in the middle of a fight? Hell no. All right. Feats of strength have nothing to do with the fight.
Keeping your
all right.
safe, face safe.
But I saw this question on Patreon, and one of the reasons why I selected it because it also has the breakfall component thing, which we'll get to. But like thinking about that weird Donnie Yen pistol leg squat there, right? I was thinking like, well, in other Wing Chun films, they've also done kind of weird things that are not, what you would say, are not Wing Chun, all right? And like for
yeah.
some reason, they don't like bug me as much as like I remember when I was in the theater and I saw that pistol squat because I got invited to go see IP Man 3. Normally I didn't see IP Man 2 in the theater,
Okay.
but I went with Rick Myers to go see Yip Man 3.
Ah.
And I just remember just seeing that and just go, what? Like this is ridiculous, right?
It's ridiculous.
But then I thought about it. Like there are other ridiculous things in other Wing Chun movies. And why do we like not get as upset about it? And I thought about that. And that's actually something I kind of wanted to like talk a little bit
what
about. Today.
scene bugs me out? Comes to mind the Yip Man movie with the young Yip Man kid. Have you seen that one? Where he fights Yip Chun?
Oh, I think it's called
In the
like
IT
Legend of Yip
shop or
Man or something.
something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can see like the obvious stunt double like taking over. Yeah. It's stunt double. Yeah, I hate it when you
Too
can see the
good.
stunt double.
Too
That always
good.
just takes me out of it
It's
right
too
away,
funny.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they used to actually be much better at hiding stunt doubles.
No,
But
not
yeah, it's
anymore.
like now they just like don't
No.
care, right?
Are you a Wing Chun instructor that needs some extra guidance in your own training? My private online Wing Chun training offers a multitude of benefits for instructors. Here are some of those benefits. 1, access to expert guidance, namely me. With my experience teaching instructors from all over the world, I can create a program just for you, whether it's the details of the advanced Wing Chun, something more fundamental, or just to help you create a program for your own students. 2, flexible learning. The training can be worked around your schedule and what's most convenient for you. I don't charge extra if you bring a training partner to do the lesson with you, so bring that partner and you can get more benefit, and I can teach the two of you how to train together. 3, comprehensive curriculum. Whether you want to teach in a more traditional way or you want to upgrade your material to a more modern style, I can help you create the perfect program for your students and for yourself. And 4, personalized coaching. This program will be exactly what you're interested in without any fluff or blah, blah, blah to run things out. We get right to it, and I want you to be happy with the improvements to your training and to the curriculum. Don't miss out on these incredible benefits. Enroll in online Wing Chun private training with me and take your Wing Chun skills to the next level. Use the code KFG online to get a 15% discount on monthly subscriptions for either 2 or 4 lessons a month. Use the link in the description below. Don't forget to use the code KFG online to get that 15% discount on the subscription of your choice as soon as possible. And I will see you online.
So I thought about it. So like for me, like the gold standard, or I should say my favorite Wing Chun movie of all time is The Prodigal Son. Now, having said that, the Prodigal Son's Wing Chun itself is not as accurate to what we would call maybe more modern day Hong Kong Wing Chun as, say, the first Yip Man movie, right?
Mhm.
Or Yip Man, The Final Fight. And it had a lot of stuff in there that was, you could say, like, that's not Wing Chun. Of course, different lineages of Wing Chun are going to argue about details like the Tan Sao, whether it's this way or this way. Or like you're gonna have like those details, but there's like a general broad kind of structure that most people can agree to. Like, all right, the Wing Chun should look something like this, right? And then it's when it deviates from the generally accepted Wing Chun tropes that that there's something to talk about. Not about like, oh well, in my lineage we do the bong sao this way, the other guy does the bong sao this way. You're arguing about like pinky placement or angle of the wrist on a movement, like that's nothing that like I would care too much about. But it's more about like when it deviates from like logic or what I think most people would agree with, right? In the final fight scene of Prodigal Son, Yun Bu, who plays, you know, Leung Chan, the Sigong of Yip Man, someone who existed in the real at some point, right? When you see that final fight scene, the final fight scene has almost the least amount of Wing Chun of any of the other Wing Chun based fight scenes, because in it, he has the revenge on Frankie Chan, whom he believes is responsible for killing his Sifu. Who he actually wasn't. It was actually his guards that killed that stabbed Leung Yi-tai, right? Spoilers.
Whoa.
And when you see it, he's like coming out and he's angry because he really believes that it's this guy's fault that his Sifu was murdered, right? So he comes out, but what does he do in that fight? He opens up with a volley of pretty decent Wing Chun chain punching and kind of back fisty like things and pak saos and all that kind of stuff, right? But then like he jumps in the air and does a double like jump kick to the chest, right? He does literal head springs, not hand springs, like head springs, right? And then inexplicably, while he's squaring off after like his exchanges, he goes into like a really bad Kwon Sao as a pre-fighting position. Okay. So like you could look at those things and say those are actually way more egregious than Donnie Yen doing a pistol squat, because at least he's kind of holding the Wing Chun hand position or something, right? Even though it actually makes no sense and it doesn't make sense in the story. And then you go like, well, why do I have way less of an issue with Prodigal Son and Donnie Yen, like, or sorry, Yun Bu, like doing head flips and double jump kicks and like, you know, and like doing with these weird kind of positions, right? And I think it's because one, it was an earlier attempt at Wing Chun, and it was Samo's second attempt at putting Wing Chun on the screen after Warriors 2, and he was also still kind of like learning the ropes. It was a style that he didn't know. He had Gai Lai as a Wing Chun fight, like a Wing Chun consultant, right? So it was like markedly more authentic than Warriors 2 in terms of like the individual movements. But I think why we can suspend disbelief in Prodigal Son and why like doing weird shit in the Yip Man movies is kind of more of an eyesore is because at least in Prodigal Son, that's supposed to be taking place in like late Qing Dynasty.
Yeah.
So there's
In
something
its
like, okay,
development.
it's a different time period. Maybe the earlier Wing Chun was a little bit different. And it was like a wilder time that we don't know anything about. There are no videos and photos of Leung Jan or Leung Yi-tai. So I think it's almost like when something happens in a history that you cannot see, you're more likely to suspend disbelief and say, well, like maybe that was how they, even though
Maybe
you know
that's
that's
how they interpret it.
you know that's not how they fought then, but there's something about like, yeah,
Just
but
the
it's
one
like,
outlier guy who does it like that.
No. I'm just saying it's in a time period where they're fighting differently, and everyone was kung fu fighting back then, right? So you're kind of like, all right, so
Yeah.
maybe like they just did that stuff, right? So I think it's easier to suspend disbelief because of the time period. Also, like a lot of the stuff that Yunbyu does that's not Wing Chun, like he's kind of like balling up his fists and he's coming at Frankie Chan in rage. That is also understood through the story because he is angry because of the death of his Sifu, right? And that's where I always think like that's where choreography can sometimes lose the thread a little bit because good movie choreography, or essentially a good fight scene or a well choreographed fight scene, is not just about doing stuff that looks cool that will entertain the audience. A fight scene is part of the movie. A fight scene is part of the story, and it needs to
Should be, yeah.
continue telling the story, right?
Yeah.
When a fight scene is just gratuitous and it's just thrown in there for the sake of, being like a popcorn fight for the audience to see, but it doesn't advance the story.
It's awesome.
Yes, but it doesn't advance the story. I feel like, okay, that's a bad sign. And then likewise, the way the people in the fight scene fight, the bad guy and the good guy, it's telling of their character. Like Frankie Chan in Prodigal Son, he had the rings and he had like a very vicious style, right? And that matched his character's character, right? And so the way he fought matched it, right? And then when you look at the IP Men movies with Donnie Yen, I think the reasons why when he does weird stuff like that doesn't really make sense is because now we're talking about someone who we do have video of and photos of and who existed in the modern time. And then when you do kind of weird, funky stuff and it's not in that kind of old style history or period piece kung fu movie, it takes you out of it a little bit. Also because there are people around today who still knew the real Yip Man, right? So it's kind of like, eh. And then also, Yip Man is quite old by the time he starts teaching Wing Chun in Hong Kong.
Okay.
So why would someone that old do something so ridiculous? He should be fighting. But in Yip Man movie to Yip Man movie, the aging Yip Man should be fighting more efficiently and smarter, not more athletically as he ages. Right? If you had put the pistol squat thing in Yip Man 1, I would have still thought it was weird, but it was a younger Yip Man. Why is the 60-something year? I mean, that's what he's supposed to be around that movie's time, right?
Oh, wow.
Doing something like that, right? So
Okay.
it's again like Yunbyu at the end of Prodigal Son is pulling his hand back, which is like a deadly sin in Wing Chun, right? He even gets Wing Chunned by Frankie Chan in it. Like at the end, he pulls his hand back to go punch Frankie Chan, and he runs at him, and because he drew his hand back, which is a deadly sin in Wing Chun, Frankie Chan just straight kicks him. So the bad guy does better Wing Chun than Leung Jan does in that movie, right? But why is it kind of okay and Donnie Yen's pistol squad is weird? Because Yunbyu's character, he plays Leung Jan, but he plays a young Leung Jan. He had just learned Wing Chun. He's not the aged, wise master who would later go on to tutor Chan Ma Shun, who would become Yip Man Sifu. He's the young hothead whose Sifu was just killed. So it's natural that he's not fully in control of his powers yet and his skills. So he's pulling his hands back, he's running, he's flipping, he's fighting in rage.
Yeah.
And is serviceable to the story that they're trying to tell. That's why him making a mistake like that and getting, punished for it makes sense, even though maybe the older, more refined Leung Jan wouldn't have made such a mistake, right? So when you see the older, supposedly more refined Yip Man doing weird, funky shit, you kind of go, I think that kind of takes you out of it a little bit, right? Or at least it does for me, right? So like, I think that's a reason why one could look at something like Prodigal Son, which has a lot of non-Wing Chun, I suppose, movements or gaffes or whatever you want to call it, and it's still like serviceable because like, you're like, yeah, but it makes sense somehow, right? Whereas like the pistol squat was gratuitous. The other thing is, like, if you look at Yip Man 1, the fight that he has more or less in the middle of the movie with the Northerner, when Fan Siu Wong finally comes to, Fan Siu Wong is the Northerner who's coming to Fatsan to challenge all the
Destroying
masters,
everything
right?
in the town.
Yip Man is kind of reluctant to challenge him because one, Yip Man is not in the movie and also more or less in real life was not a established kung fu instructor. He didn't have a school. And the Northerner came and like beat up all the school owners, and then everyone's telling him, "Yeah, but Yip Man is the best," and he wants to challenge Yip
That
Man.
random guy down the block is
Yeah,
the best.
exactly, right? The guy
No
who doesn't
school,
have a kung
yeah.
fu school, right? And Yip Man is reluctant, and then finally, when he shows up to his house, he's basically forced to fight him, right? And the the interesting thing about that fight is there's a far less egregious weird thing that Donnie does in it, but it's still weird nonetheless. He starts off the fight, in the Wing Chun Jong Sao, and then he has the famous line like, Wing Chun Yip Man, right? Where he
Mm.
basically introduces himself like, I do Wing Chun, my name is Yip Man, just by saying Wing Chun Yip Man, right? But the funny thing is that, and I've told this before, but it's one of my favorites. So when I first saw Yip Man, IP Man, the first time, was 2008 when it came out.
Yeah. In the
And
theaters.
no. Someone had sent me a bootleg of it.
Oh,
Like the
wow.
second it came out in Hong Kong.
Okay.
All right. Statute of limitations is already well past on that one.
Well,
And it
past.
was the Cantonese version of IP Man. But the subtitles were burned into this kind of illegal transfer. And the subtitles were done almost like with a Google Translate. So it was a literal translation, which no human had gone in there to correct the subtitles. So of course, as in Wing Chun means like to praise or to sing or to chant. Chun means spring, right? Yip as in yip means leaf, like, and man is question or ask. Like, so what a lot of Wing Chun people don't know is man sao, asking hand. That's the same man as yip man. All right. So
Ooh.
literally his name is Leaf Question. All right. And then
Okay.
so of course these these automatic like translation things are trying to like figure out some kind of context with these words, right? And so when he says Wing Chun Yip Man, the subtitles, which just is just taking a literal translation, underneath it said sing spring, ask a leaf. All right. And I always remember like sing spring, ask a leaf, right? Which can you imagine someone comes to fight you and like you just break him mentally by saying sing spring, ask a leaf, right? And he's like, what?
It's like,
And then you just run in and start
yeah.
charging him, right?
What?
So
Wait,
like
what?
so the fight actually starts off like, Donnie is in a proper Jong Sao. He's not in a pistol squat. He's just kind of blocking and defending. He's not really fighting back, right? And then eventually he starts fighting back. And then eventually, he beats the guy. But in the middle of the fight, they get separated. I think it's after Yip Chun, his kid, kind of comes
runs
in.
on the tricycle or something.
Yeah, and he says, "Hey, mom says you better start fighting back so you don't break more stuff."
Oh, okay.
Right, because it was clear that his dad was just
Yeah.
kind of defending, right? And of course, the Northerner gets pissed off, like Yip Man is not really fighting him. And then Yip Man inexplicably starts doing the Tan Sao from the Sunum Tao form. He has his hand withdrawn in the Sao Kun position in the retracted hand and starts drawing out the Tan Sao.
Yeah.
As if somehow that makes sense in the middle of the fight. He's already put his hands forward in Donnie Yen's version of the Jong Sao.
Yeah.
And then he decides to do this.
He
And
had
it's
to do
like,
the forms real quick.
yeah, it's just so weird because as someone who practices Wing Chun, you just see like, that is bizarre. Because it's like the training methods. All right.
Yeah.
Like for me, it would be like if a bodybuilder is out there on the Mr. Universe or the Mr. Olympia stage. All right. You go out there to show the whole package. All right. To quite literally, right? And
Oh,
and you're
no.
there and you got to hit all your poses, right? But that would be like if one of those Mr. Olympia contestants went up there and just started doing bench pressing on stage.
On stage.
It's like, no, homie.
No.
That's the training
Yeah.
for the events.
Uh,
The pulling your hand back and doing the Tan Sao slowly, that's the training for doing Wing Chun, right? That's not the fight. And there seems to be kind of like a
Stop.
conflation of this, right? And so that's where I was like, I thought it was weird. It reminded me of the late Chanchi Man's story that he told me, which I've told on the podcast before about when he challenged William Chang to a fight, right? So Chan Zivu, when he was young, he had learned a little bit of Choi Lei Fat, and his friend William Chang at that time was a Wing Chun guy, right? A teenager practicing Wing Chun, and was kind of goading Chanchi Man to try out his Wing Chun or whatever, and then they went onto a rooftop
That's how it
to kind of test each other out, and then as was sometimes, I suppose, the tradition in those days, you would bust out a couple shapes, like basically do a couple moves from the form of your style to, before you would have your fight. So it's almost like in an old kung fu movie, right? If you were a Hung Gar guy, maybe you would bust out a couple, like, couple shapes, a couple jisaos, right? A couple tiger crane poses or whatever,
The
right?
guy's like 10 feet away.
Yeah, and
he's
if you're a
like,
Charlie Fut guy, you bust out a couple Charlie Fut poses, right? And if you're a Wing Chun guy, what do? All right, you bust out the Siunam Tao form,
right.
put your audience to sleep, and then beat them up, right?
Make them,
So yeah, make them fall asleep,
make
right?
'em
Wow,
woozy.
that form is really cool. Now watch this, okay? Slowly, right?
That's a
And
tactic.
so Chen Chi Man told me this is basically the first time he saw Wing Chun. So while William Chang was doing the slow tanzo, the Siunam Tao form, Chen Chi Man put a coin in his hand, like as if his hand was out for begging, right? And so every time since Chen Chi Man told me that story that I've seen IP Man 1, every time he just decides to pull his hand back and do the
You wanna
Siunam Tao
put a
form,
coin.
right? I'm just thinking the Northerners, like his hand's going to come out, he's going to put a coin in his hand and make fun of
Someone's
him,
got to
right?
make that meme.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really funny because so it's not the case with that particular movement, the tansa with the hand pulled back, but when our hand is pulled back or withdrawn in the form, this is sometimes called saokun. But sao not meaning hand, that would be sao, meaning withdraw. It's the withdrawed fist. It's literally saokun means to withdraw or take. So you're withdrawing the fist. It's a standardized position in the form because although Wing Chun is a style that purports to use both hands independently, when we teach the first form, we really start with one hand at a time. There are a couple exceptions, the first set, the fourth set, the last set. There are a couple movements where you're either moving your hands in tandem or with each other. But for the most part, the Siunam Tao form is one arm at a time, right? And that's to kind of focus on the individual points and to focus on the little ideas of the form, right? So when we're working one hand at a time, the other hand is pulled back, not because it's not doing anything, but because it actually is doing something. When your hand is in this retracted position, there should be like maybe 1 finger distance away from your body. So that means that hand is not actually resting on your body. You see a lot of times in Wing Chun people, they just kind of rest the hand there. And that means that hand is actually now dead.
Yeah.
And if you were to keep, let's say, 1 pinky width distance away from your body, keep the flat part of the fist, the kunmin, the face of the fist, level with your solar plexus, then you would get a nice stretch on the head of the shoulder, which is very good because we tax the living piss out of our shoulders in Wing Chun. So by pulling this one back in the form, you get a nice little stretch on the head of the shoulder, which is good to give you a little bit of balance. But also because that hand is not physically resting on your body, then you are actually controlling it. And you are controlling it independently of what the other hand is doing. So it's not a passive rest hand. It's actually a kind of a neutral position that has all these other effects. But one of them is you have to control the arm in that position. All right.
It's
You
like
cannot,
being able to do that party trick.
Which party trick? Oh, yeah. Like a rubbing, like
You rub
patting
your
your
belly
head
and-
and rubbing your belly. at the
Patting
same
your
time.
head and rubbing your belly at the same time.
Yes,
Like
exactly,
this is such
right?
a.
So you're doing it's not quite as difficult, but it is doing 2 different things at once. But then in the form when we physically withdraw the fist, all right, from out here and we go back, that can also be called hao chang, which means the
chang.
rearward elbow, right? So it's a matter of whether the sivu is talking about you're just retracting the fist to come to a neutral position, or talking about the fist being retracted already, or you're talking about the action of this rearward elbow, which, someone comes up behind you, give them an elbow. It's not like a high percentage thing, but it's a thing, right? And what I see, even like some Wing Chun sivus within my own lineage, is they try to create funny applications with this one here. I just saw so many people send me stuff all the time, and it's like, man, don't send me Wing Chun stuff because
Please.
everyone, what's so funny? Like everyone sends me Wing Chun stuff, and it's like, first of all, I don't watch any. I really watch Wing
I
Chun
don't
stuff.
send you
Like,
enough Wing Chun stuff.
no, you don't need to send me any Wing Chun stuff because just by virtue of my Instagram algorithm and just people sending me stuff, like whenever there's something cute Wing Chun wise, like I have 50 people sending it to me in
The
a day,
same,
right? Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah, like
Oh,
and also
goodness.
like
You're about to have 51 people sending it to you.
and then we
I
just had
love
like
it.
we just had that Bleecker thing like like a week or so ago where he made like some non-response, and like I still have people today sending me like, hey, did you see that Bleecker
Did you see this
responded to your
video?
video? And I go, yeah, and I've already responded to that, right? And it's like,
I
but it's just every single day, right?
love it.
So yeah, and people send me stuff. Well, I don't mind if people send me cool like pop culture Wing Chun stuff, right? But when people send me stuff specifically from my quote unquote own lineage, that's why I'm like, I don't need to see any of that. I've seen enough of my own lineage's stuff to last me a lifetime, all right? But it's like showing some really wacky
That's
like
funny.
punching under the guy's arm and then pulling his arm back and doing the elbow thing, which is like very kind of what I would have done 20 years ago. But it's funny to see people still doing those things and thinking that those are the interpretations of the forms, because like you can interpret the forms many different ways. But the problem, what I see, which also hits in the Yip Man choreography, is are you using the idea from the form in fighting, or are you trying to make the fighting look like the form? And there's a huge difference between the two. There could be, for example, when one arm goes out and the other one comes back in the form, there's clearly a push and pull thing going on there, which can be used in many different instances in your training. Push pull dynamic is a big thing in martial arts, not just in like jujitsu or judo or throwing, but in Wing Chun as well. But the push pull dynamic is meant to be done in more subtle ways than literally copying the form and doing it on a partner, because then they're making choreography out of the form. They're not showing you the use of this movement as it might make sense in a practical fighting situation. And that's where you kind of see, what does this form thing mean? Well, it doesn't mean you do it in the middle of a fight, Donnie Yen. All right, okay? And so that's where like I kind of see like people doing like
Hence, the fighting techniques were created first, and then the form was created to teach those.
yes, and I think that that's a real obvious chain of events when you say it out loud, but I think a lot of Wing Chun people miss that point, because what do you learn first? Oftentimes you learn the form first. So there's kind of like in your mind when you think about it, you go, okay, well, what came first? Well, clearly the people who developed the Wing Chun style over time most likely started by creating fighting techniques, concepts, principles, ideas on how to defend and how to counterattack other different types of attacks from local area martial arts, right? Because I mean, if you need to develop a system for whatever reason, let's just say in Wing Chun, a system that can be taught relatively quickly, you don't invent the Sunam Tao form and then go, okay, so how are we going to fight with these movements? Okay, because it wouldn't make any sense, right? You would never come up with a Sunam Tao form if not for having an idea of what those
What the
movements would
movements
have been
were,
in
yeah.
fighting, right? So clearly, fighting techniques,
Context.
fighting practices, training exercises, those things were developed first. And then out of a need to teach that to other people, the forms are developed and then refined over time as like a codex to transfer the information of the system. But clearly the system's designed first. Then the forms are developed to teach the system to others. And then over every successive generation, the form is refined and adapted according to the needs of that generation, even though there's some very conservative Wing Chun people that either don't like that the form gets updated or believe that it never was updated, right? Like they believe that what they're doing is the same as what was done 150 years ago, which is kind of ridiculous. So anyway, it's like, so clearly when you think about it, obviously the forms came after the fighting style is developed. But then Wing Chun, modern Wing Chun people, you learn the form. And if you're, for example, in a WT school, I can't speak for others, you would learn the fighting application alongside learning that form. But in your mind, you're still thinking like, yeah, there's the form and then there's the how to use it. So you're thinking that these fighting applications are coming out of the form. But the fighting applications are coming out of Wing Chun. The form is just one way to teach you those mechanics and ideas and movements when you don't have the stress of someone trying to murder your face with their fist. And it's supposed to help you with the position, alignment, angle, structure, all the buzzwords people like to hear. um, when you don't have someone physically coming at you. But the fighting techniques were developed first. That's why they knew to put them in the form.
Yeah.
It's not the
Yeah.
form was developed and then some ingenious way to fight with those form movements was created afterwards, right? So I think that there's a little bit of that going on where I think people just got it backwards because of the order that people learn it in, right? And I think maybe before we go on to the next topic, and the last thing I want to say is it's obviously challenging to choreograph Wing Chun in movies because Wing Chun is relatively repetitive, you know, because it's a self-defense fighting style is not a ring art. And I don't mean like, oh, there are no rules in the street, bro. Never been my gig as a martial arts guy to argue like that. I'm a huge fan of competitive fighting, sport, martial arts, full contact fighting.
Big fan.
And I'm not the guy that says like, oh, well, the Wing Chun guy just went in there, but, you know, was able to do like, you know, this eye gouging. He would, you know, stop any MMA guy. Like, I'm not that. I don't ever argue those points. Although there very clearly is a difference between self-defense, self-protection, fighting on the street, so-called street fighting, and ring fighting, and full contact and MMA. And there are differences between these. And they're not the things that are normally argued, at least in my perspective. So a self-defense art has to be something that, well, if we take away all the kind of modern stuff we need to do with self-defense, awareness, if it's a predatory violence, de-escalation, if it's social violence, which it most likely is. Like, there's a whole aspect to self-defense which has nothing to do with fighting, right? Has to do with awareness, distance management, when someone is being aggressive. I'm not talking about distance management in the fight. De-escalation, getting the guy to calm down, body language, the way you use your voice, adapting it according to what the potential threat is. There's like this whole corpus of shit you need to know if you want to even talk about self-defense in a modern day, right? If we kind of peel that away and we say, okay, we've done all the things we can try to do to avoid the fight. We, you know, did the Mr. Miyagi try to no be there, right?
Yeah.
We tried to talk the guy down. We tried whatever. Like, for whatever reason, the guy just grabs you and attacks you, or this guy's in your face. You have nowhere to go. You cannot. You have to now do something. So a style like Wing Chun or any, you know, properly designed combative style should, if the practitioner is kind of backed up against the wall, like figuratively and literally, give them something really quick and replicable to do that doesn't require you to have to think a lot, right? If you have someone screaming in your face about to take a swing and you have to think like, okay, it's a right arm, left arm, what if he goes for this? What if I go for that? And you're now suddenly making all of these calculations while the guy is getting amped up. The moment he moves, he's going to knock you out because that guy's already knows what they're going to do. And you're thinking like, well, is he going to punch me? Is he going to kick me? Is he going to try to grab me? Can I get out of here? And you have all these things going on and you don't see the punch coming,
That's when
right?
you get clocked.
So that's why the moment it's most likely going to happen, you have to have a very different mindset. You have to be somewhat one-track minded. You have to be able to do something quickly, efficiently, and hopefully effective. And that's replicable. That doesn't force you to like make all of these difficult decisions. You kind of have to know, okay, when I'm in this situation, these are really the only things I can do. And there you need a style that's kind of, that has a simple structure. You don't have, in other words, the chance to take your assailant and run them through a round of a feeling out process and see how they react to your feints, see how they react to your kicks, see if they're very skittish, see if you need to be a counter fighter or you need to press. You don't have that. You just have someone in your face screaming, then that person takes a swing, boom, you need to go in there and do something that works, right? So Wing Chun is a style that's kind of for that. And as a result, it tends to kind of repeat certain movement patterns a little bit more because there's a kind of a basic process that we go through. And when you're now talking about fight choreography, if you're always doing the same thing over and over again, the audience is going to get bored. All right. Even if that thing is really cool. If you had like a fight scene, which was nothing but like high level taekwondo kicks, but no one punched or no one ever grabbed anyone or no one ever did anything different. Like the first few volleys of high kicks, let's say you had like Huang Zhanglei in his prime and, you know, like Tan Tao Lang, like the best kickers in Hong Kong cinema. But let's say they only were doing kicks. Maybe you could make a film or half a film or a few fight scenes where it's like almost only kicks, right? But you couldn't make a whole series where there was nothing else, even if the kicks were really good and on point and fast.
Yeah.
At some point, you'd be like, okay, I've seen this already.
Loses his flair.
Yeah. So the issue with martial arts like Wing Chun or martial arts that are more specialized is in movie choreography, it's going to start to look repetitive after a while. Even if it's practical, even if it's good, the audience is going to, like, if you just keep chain punching all the time, all right, the audience is going to go, okay, we've seen this already, right? So how do you give novelty to a style that, you know, basically is very repetitive?
Do pistol squats.
You do a fucking pistol squat
Yeah.
in the middle of the goddamn fight.
Yeah, that's
You know
it.
what I mean?
That's how it's done.
Yeah. You try to find some other way to kind of punch it up, slow it down, speed it up, move it over here,
Yeah.
put the Wing Chun in this environment, put it in that environment. And, so you're going to have to do it. So I understand why they have to do it. I think it would be better if they really want to add variety to it, is to put Wing Chun in different environments versus different opponents, which, to be fair, they kind of have done in the Yip Man movies. But when I saw IP Man 4, which was the latest one, a lot of that fight choreography in the final fight scene with the oldest version of IP Man, we'll see, it looked like they were just copying their old homework. It just, like, I saw just a lot of full swathes of choreography, which were just copies of stuff they had done in 3 or stuff they had done in 2. And so, yeah, I felt like, that was at least...
It's not the one when he comes to New York.
No, San Francisco. Yeah. So, I mean, if there was ever a movie in the IP Man franchise that needed the pistol squad, it was the fourth one.
Yeah, okay.
So anyway, yeah, so that's what I have to say. So to answer the question, what is the thing that Yip Man was doing with that, squatting on one leg? It was a pistol squat. It has nothing to do with Wing Chun, but it's still in there nonetheless.
Yeah.
All right, so then we got the second part of the question. Can you read that one for me again?
So many people are confused about basics in Wing Chun Chi-Sao. Some view it as a collection of moves, and masters confuse their own students by talking of principles and concepts without telling them what's what. The 15 Chi-Sao Fundamentals is my attempt at explaining Wing Chun Chi-Sao from a perspective of principles, but also with the basic techniques required to express those principles. It shows the framework for Hong Kong Wing Chun Chi-Sao, in particular, the training of Pun Sao and Lap Da. This is necessary training before going on to the higher and more spontaneous expressions of Chi-Sao. Right now, if you use the code KFG Chi-Sao, you can get a signed copy of my book for the price of the unsigned one. Click on the link in the description below and use the code KFG Chi-Sao at checkout to get a signed copy of this full-color, over 230-page manual on the vital foundational training exercise of Wing Chun. This offer is good while supplies last, so get yours today.
KFG, does WT have breakfalls, rolls, and get-up techniques?
Okay, yes. Great question. So, so
Wow.
here we come into the realm of different lineages and what they have. So, I think
Yes.
traditionally in Yip Man Wing Chun, the answer would basically be no. All right. Now, do practitioners of various lineages of Yip Man Wing Chun, do they practice breakfalls? 100%. But the fact that a lineage does any kind of breakfall or falling or rolling doesn't mean that the previous generation of that lineage had that. All right. So things can be added, deleted, and refined, right? The question is always, all right, maybe a certain style does breakfalls, but the implication is, well, did they get that from the previous generation or did they add that in there, right? So I can say pretty assuredly, although I don't like to speak for the other Wing Chun lineages, that breakfalls and get-ups are generally not a part of Wing Chun, like the Wing Chun canon, so to speak, as taught from Grandmaster Yip Man. I remember even Augustine Fong in his old video series, and he's from the Ho Ka Ming lineage. He had some stuff where you're on the ground and then you kind of get up or whatever, some basic stuff. So I think that even in the early days, that some of Yip Man students kind of appreciated the fact that no matter how good you are, you could fall on the ground.
Okay.
And that kind of requires you to have some game plan on the ground, whether that is how you actually fall or what do you do if you're on the ground and the other person's standing? How do you stand up? And I think to varying degrees, some lineages in the Yip Man line have added their own stuff as far as that goes, and some of them have ignored it completely. The thing is that in Wing Chun,
I see.
and the question here asks about WT, so it's specifically
Yes.
my lineage, but I wanted to just kind of preface it with talking about that in general. I think that, yeah, some people have done it, have added it, like I said, Augustine Fong, and certainly the Learning system that I come from has also added kind of something to that kind of body of that vocabulary list of martial arts. Like, you need to have some words from that list if you want to, in my opinion, consider yourself competent. But there are some people on the Yip Man spectrum, and I remember this um, because when UFC started to become a thing.
Okay.
All right. That was in the 90s. All right.
Huh.
Still the early 90s, 94, or I guess mid 90s already. But before like the internet took off as we know it. All right.
Right.
Where you really had all these chat rooms and stuff that everyone was going to, not just like the nerdiest of nerds. And I remember in the early, like, because I used to be what's called a lurker. When I was training in Germany, which was from 99 to 2002, I used to go to internet cafes. So it's dating me there already. And
okay.
go on those like Wing Chun like chat rooms and, you know, message boards, and would just read what people were talking about.
Okay.
Okay. I didn't participate in those things for the most part. I didn't, because I didn't have anything to say. I was still very green.
Mhm.
But that's where I kind of saw like who all the players were, like whether from the William Chung lineage or the Leung lineage, or like Hawkins Chung or whatever. Like, after a while, you kind of see who these people are, who the main posters are. Sometimes they would post under their own name. Often, just like YouTube, many of our YouTube commenters, they need to hide their face. Very funny. Our good friend Steve Carriage, who we've interviewed a couple times.
Yeah.
He's
the
having
man.
he's having a bit of a spat with another
Oh.
a guy who's kind of a bit of a Bruce Lee YouTuber, and someone who publishes a lot of Bruce Lee photos.
Nice.
Apparently, a lot of those photos he's publishing are the stuff that Steve Carriage has put out, and Steve Carriage is like getting kind of salty about that. And it's
I have those books.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they're great, and
Yeah.
it's funny just to kind of see, like, you know, that and that
Wow.
guy who is kind of ganking Steve Carriage's work. He has a Facebook page, but he doesn't ever show his own face. And Steve Carriage wrote this like funny roast. He's like, "It's called Facebook, mate, not show your Facebook."
So not to get too off topic, is this anything that Steve can kind of deal with, or is this another one of these like kind of like Bruce Lee Real Fight Channel beardy things where he's just stealing Steve's stuff wholesale and
So
like-
this guy's a little different. This guy doesn't talk. So he's not like a guy making up Bruce Lee stories. He just will post a lot of, like, Steve Carriage. If you've ever seen Steve Carriage's books that he's made with Darren Chua, they're great. I
Yeah.
mean, like, they're literally some of the best Bruce Lee books you can get in terms of the photos, but not just the photos like being kind of rare, but also the quality of the photos
Right.
and the stories and the behind the scenes stories. Like,
got
he'll
a couple
do a
in
book
Hong
about,
Kong.
you know, Way of the Dragon, or
Yeah.
do a book about Fists of Fury, and they'll interview like all like the background people, the lighting people, and you'll get these stories that you wouldn't otherwise have gotten. So in terms, like, for real Bruce Lee nerds, all right, not the people who think Tom Bleecker is actually saying anything true. I mean, people who actually give a shit about Bruce Lee.
Tom Bleecker roast there. Yes.
You don't read Unsettled Matters. You get Steve Carriage's books. You get John
right.
Little's books, right?
Right.
And so anyway, I thought it was funny because, like, you know, like the beefs that go on, right? But I just thought it's the don't show your Facebook. That's not what it is,
Could
right?
be Tom Bleecker on the low.
And no, because Tom Bleecker has very clearly shown himself. He's not interested. He actually doesn't like Bruce Lee. Let's be honest. He
no.
pretends to. When he gets attacked, he gets like, "Oh, Bruce was my buddy."
Yeah.
But like, let's be honest. When you actually read what he writes, you look at the nature of his videos. Let's be honest. He doesn't like Bruce Lee. All right. No. So this guy on Facebook, he takes like a lot of the photos from the Carriage books, and then he'll put them in these like montages and put them in YouTube videos, and he'll never give credit.
Oh.
So that's kind of like where it is right now. Anyway, that was a little OT. So as far as the falling and rolling stuff, like, so on the Yip Man Wing Chun spectrum, right? And like I said, I know this because of on the chat rooms. In when I used to lurk and I used to read what people were writing, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the big thing was like, well, you know, now because of MMA, and, you know, I don't even think it was called MMA at that point. I think it was still No Holds Barred or whatever. NHB. You know, what do you do if someone tries to take you down? Like, you know, the thing is, what is your Wing Chun going to do if someone tries to, you know, if you fight a good wrestler or a good jiu-jitsu guy, right? So those were some of the conversations that were being had back then, right? And of course, I would sit there and watch and read these things. And so you would have on one end of the spectrum that like the Wing Chun as is, the traditional, classical, old school, Yip Man according to the scrolls of Yip Man Wing Chun has everything you need to stop any kind of attack, right? So you had like this kind of really, if you think Wing Chun is lacking anything, then you are not a true Wing Chun person. It was the no true Scotsman fallacy, like on full effect, right?
Okay.
And so, and this is how like people could kind of try to stigmatize someone else. Like if you think Wing Chun is missing something, it's because you're not a real Wing Chun person. You don't trust Wing Chun, or you haven't learned the right Wing Chun. All right. Or any combination of those three. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they were like, well, our Wing Chun style specifically has certain movements we use to fight against grapplers, and we train these things, right? And then there would be yet another faction, which is like, we're literally teaching wrestling sprawls and anti-takedown stuff from wrestling and jiu-jitsu in our Wing Chun, mixing it in. So you had the guys who mix stuff. You had the guys who say, like, within Wing Chun, we have our own technology to handle it. And then the guys who are almost like, if I just gave Hoist Gracie one Yatsi Chongkun, he's gonna be through the fucking cage or whatever, right? So you had like this spectrum there, and then of course, what do these three different factions do? They argue with each other, right? The guys who say no, in Wing Chun we have specific moves to stop a wrestling takedown are arguing with the people who are borrowed stuff from jiu-jitsu and wrestling, who are telling like that stuff wouldn't actually work, and they're going back and forth at it. Then you have the ultra conservative guys who are like, yeah, if the guy just comes in to try to take me down, my Wing Chun straight kick or my Wing Chun straight punch is going to turn his face into spaghetti, and then I'll never need to worry about the takedown. And then you have the, well, what if the guy grabs you, or what if the guy tries to clinch you up or take you down? Then those same factions would be like, okay, well, the guys who added the jiu-jitsu stuff, well, if he gets past my chi sao and my chain punches and my elbows, then I have some wrestling and jiu-jitsu tricks up my sleeve. That was the one faction.
Yeah.
If the opponent gets past my chi sao or whatever, we have more close range and buji shit we can do to the guy or whatever. So we still have stuff in Wing Chun we could do. And then the ultra conservative guys were like, they're never getting past my chi sao and elbows, right? And then so the thing is like, and that was kind of that was the argument like 20 years ago. Wing Chun since then has changed quite a bit, because you have much more of an acceptance among many of the factions to kind of update the methods to make sure that our students can handle these things, even if they believe those methods come from Wing Chun, which is kind of more how I do it. Or whether some people are more open to adding and wrestling and jiu-jitsu stuff into their Wing Chun, which is not exactly what I do. But then it's just that super conservative faction that thinks that Wing Chun itself has everything it ever needs ever. And if you think Wing Chun is missing anything, it's because you didn't learn the right Wing Chun. You don't really believe in Wing Chun. Or you're not really a Wing Chun person, right? So it's like it's not like an argument of the techniques. It's they have to stigmatize. The moment someone has to stigmatize you, is the moment they don't have an argument, because your arguments have to stand on reasoning and facts, not on, well, the reason why your Wing Chun can't stuff a takedown is because you're not a real Wing Chun person. Okay, well then show me what a real Wing Chun person does, and I can discuss with you whether I would have done the same thing not knowing, or I would have done something differently, or I think what you're saying is fucking absurd, right? So you have to understand so all that's changed in those like 20 years since I used to lurk those forums is that the group that thinks you need to add wrestling and jiu-jitsu to make Wing Chun work, or the group that thinks we need to develop the methods within Wing Chun to better handle grappling, those groups have kind of expanded and eaten away the guys who think that Wing Chun has everything it'll ever need ever, including against stuff they never had to fight about back then. But that faction still exists. And in fact, the more the other two factions grow, the more that ultra-conservative faction that thinks that they're doing the most authentic and traditional Wing Chun, the more they kind of buckle down and almost become like religious zealots at some point, right? Because it's also clear that Yip Man himself had a very flexible attitude about how Wing Chun could be adjusted, whether it was making adjustments in the Siunam Tao form for Wong Sun Leung after he got kicked, or whether it was re-editing the wooden dummy form to, for the especially the last two sets in after 1966, whether it was what clearly seems to be his constant edits of his knife form over the course of his teaching period. Yip Man, it would seem, had a somewhat flexible attitude about updating methods, but then his own students sometimes are even more conservative than the
Yeah.
teacher, right? And so it's interesting to see how that's kind of almost more of a social thing than a martial arts thing, right?
Mm.
This kind of like if you're changing the Sifu's methods, you're not a real Wing Chun person or
Oh.
whatever, blah 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 blah. Even
Spell.
even though there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Yip Man had changed many things on his own. So it's funny how those things have changed, right? But I remember that there was a faction that really believed like if you train your Siu Nim Tao form correctly, the real way, which by the way, just like a lot of revealed religion, the real way happens to be the way they're doing it, not the way you're doing it, right? It's always the way they got the good stuff, you didn't, right?
Tuh.
If you have like the right rooting and mechanics and sinking the weight and the weight distribution, the
Posture.
breathing and the mental and the mindful and the melding of the 5 elements and the yin and the yang.
Mm.
If you have all these things, then
Must have.
actually no one can take you down because your stance is going to be so rooted.
Yeah.
All right. And I go, okay, well then just ask Gordon Ryan to see if he can take you down. All right.
Okay.
Or ask any jujitsu guy one
Uh.
weight class lower than you
Uh-huh.
to take you down. You can stand there and show them how rooted your stance is.
Okay.
All right.
luck.
I think the belief in those kind of things is in direct proportion to the lack of having ever trained against someone who's trying to do that, right? So it's like it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I remember like there
Love
were
that
people
effect.
arguing that if you did your Siunim Tao right and you learned how to quote unquote shift properly, I mean, the turn, and you learned how to sit in your stance correctly, and you had, like I said, you had the right sauce because you were in the right lineage, you had the right, balance of yin yang and structure and chi flow and meridian flow and
Yeah.
elements and all this kind of stuff, and like the low pan compass and feng shui, and your hair was parted to the right side, and your tongue was in the right place in your mouth to ensure perfect chi flow to the meridians in your feet, which keep you glued to the floor.
Mm.
Then no one would be able to take you down anyway. Meanwhile, no one's actually ever demonstrated this in the real world against anyone worthwhile, but they'll tell you that they have it, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, we know that this is not the case, all right? Because it's physics. We're human beings. There's no revealed knowledge that's going to make you do things that are beyond what is capable in physics. And also, like if you just look, and I know it's a bit anecdotal, but it is something nonetheless. There is a kind of a hindsight bias, which is hindsight bias normally means like knowing what you know now. When you look at something in the past, you go like, yeah, well, obviously that was going to happen. Yeah, but it wasn't obvious at that time. But there's also kind of this like reverse hindsight bias. Well, it's still hindsight bias, but Wing Chun people sometimes look at the old times, like the 50s, when Yip Man students were going out and having challenge fights with other schools and saying like, oh man, that was the golden era. Like those guys, they really had it in a way that Wing Chun people nowadays don't. Now, I see the strength in that argument, okay? The guys who learned in the 50s from Grandmaster Yip Man and really learned directly from him were doing a more purer Wing Chun because they only knew what Yip Man taught them, and they were going out and scrapping with other guys and testing it out. So, in terms of like the purity of what they were trying out coming from Yip Man and then they're testing it out in the real world.
Mm.
Yes. Okay. They hadn't had a chance yet for the other martial arts styles to start to look at what Wing Chun was doing and start to figure out how they could counter it.
Yeah.
Because they were new on the scene. They hadn't yet
Wow.
seen what would happen when certain things in Wing Chun failed and they maybe didn't have the rescue technique on tap because they were never in that position yet, right? So we're also looking at other people who knew nothing about Wing Chun.
New
They
way to
didn't
beat
know that they
ass.
were going to be blitzed with chain punches.
Shit.
They thought Wing Chun was maybe some other style. It's going to try to grab and punch and do single techniques. And suddenly these guys are running in and blitzing them, right?
Mm.
And if you've never dealt with someone who's trying to blitz you, whether it's a Wing Chun person or like someone in boxing who's a little green and just gunning for your head, well, if you don't know what to do, yeah, it's a problem. But once you know that the other guy's going to try to blitz you and you can deal with distance and stuff, well, now the Wing Chun does need to develop.
Okay.
All right. So there's a huge hindsight bias in thinking that the success of Wing Chun in the early days when no one knew the Wing Chun strategy somehow means that those guys knew something that we don't understand now. It's like, yeah, maybe a majority of people who are doing Wing Chun now do it as a hobby, and they're not really going out there and fighting in the way those guys in the early period did, or the way that MMA guys continue to now. I'm 100% on board with that. But the idea that it was because they had a certain knowledge that is somehow unavailable to us nowadays, that's kind of ridiculous. Maybe they had the training and they had the experience, but the experience they had was also against other local area kung fu guys. All right. Other people who they weren't at that time testing themselves out really against boxers, exception being when Bruce Lee actually had his fight against a boxer, but that was in boxing. All right. Not in a, they weren't. Yeah, but it was also Bruce Lee boxing another boxer.
Yeah.
It wasn't Bruce Lee using his Wing Chun in a rooftop street fight against someone who's trying to box him. All right. And they weren't fighting. And I'm not the first one to say this. In fact, I think Jerry Young, who's one of the more prominent kind of the younger generation in the Wong Sun Leung lineage, also mentioned something like, all due respect to his Sifu or Sigong. I'm not sure who Wong Sun Leung is to him, but he was not fighting boxers and kickboxers and jiu-jitsu people and the people we have to fight nowadays, which is why I'm always a huge proponent of you have to judge people in the context of their time, not go like, oh, well, if that guy came nowadays, yeah, of course, but you could say that about any style in any sport. Take the guys who take the NBA players or the professional basketball players from the 60s and put them up against the guys nowadays. It would be a trouncing. I think a lot of famous heavyweight boxers from, the 40s and 50s, not talking about Muhammad Ali's era or whatever, like that older, they would struggle with the boxers nowadays because the boxers nowadays know what those guys did and they're doing other stuff now too. And it's developed over time. The jiu-jitsu guys, the jiu-jitsu of nowadays is far more technical than the jiu-jitsu of 20 years ago. The MMA guys are more technical. The full contact karate guys are more technical, right? This is what happens over time. Only Wing Chun people or traditional Kung Fu people think that this knowledge exists in a bubble and that it's only gotten worse. Maybe because the Wing Chun guys don't fight as much as they used to. But the idea that somehow the knowledge isn't out there is ridiculous. So anyway, having said that, there were literally people who believed they could not be taken down, all right, on one end of the spectrum. And when we look at one of the famous and one of the few records we have of those challenge fights from those days was the fight of Wong Sun Leung's student, Wu Chan Lam. Wu Chan Lam was like one of the early students of Wong Sun Leung, and he went out there and he had a fight with, I believe it was a Northern Mantis guy, and it's a black and white video. It's one of the few that are out there, and you could see the two of them fighting, and you could see basically how I would imagine a lot of those fights back then went, right? You saw kind of two guys, a little timid to go after each other because, again, there was no idea of wearing any kind of safety equipment. So, yeah, I mean, if you get punched, even if there's some kind of gentlemanly understanding, you're not going to, like Fight Club, break the guy's face into pieces. Still, you're fighting without any equipment. It's real, right? So you could see there's like a lot of hesitation in both of them, right? But you see Wu Chan Lam, he's there in the Wing Chun Zhong, so very traditional frontal stance, kind of stalking the praying mantis guy. And the mantis guy just wants to kind of jump in and jump out. The mantis guy's looking for a punch or a kick that he can do his techniques against, right? But the Wing Chun guy doesn't even have a leg forward. The Wing Chun guy has this odd squared up stance and he's not giving him anything. And every time the mantis guy comes in, Wu Chan Lam just blitzes him, and the mantis guy basically kind of runs away. Because you have to imagine most of those guys weren't used to being blitzed. But in that fight, even though Wu Chan Lam is very clearly the dominant fighter and very clearly wins the fight, both the mantis guy and Wu Chan Lam literally fall down in the fight. Okay? Like one, he actually hits him over the ledge once, and they literally both fall down because it's fighting and shit happens, right? But what I would like to impress upon the people, the very few, and they certainly don't listen to this podcast if they are, but the few who believe like if you learned back then in those days when they were still teaching the real Wing Chun, because for sure the Wing Chun was a lot closer to what Ip Man was teaching. I mean, Wu Chan Lam learned from Wong Sun Leung in a very early time period. For sure, Wong Sun Leung had his own way of doing things. But here we're talking about people, this is like the 50s and 60s. This is that golden era that people think like, oh, those guys really knew something or whatever. And Wu Chanlam was a very good fighter and an excellent example of a Wong Sunlung student. He literally fell down. And he didn't really fall down because anything special happened.
Yeah,
It's just like you can literally fall down. So the idea that like he wasn't even thrown, he wasn't judo thrown or taken down or knocked backwards in the kind of more traditional, he literally just fell down because of the chaos of the fight.
Yeah.
If you could literally just slip and fall in the middle of the fight,
The
what
old
makes
banana
you think
peel
that
trick.
you couldn't be tripped or taken down or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay. When no special outside force was being exerted
Right.
upon his body
It's just a balance thing.
that had the intention of putting him to the ground and he went to the ground.
Yeah.
What happens when there's intention, right? So, or in other words, if a spry and fit Wu Chanlam can fall down for no major reason in the middle of the fight, yes, Wing Chun people can get taken down and slip and fall. And even if a Wing Chun person could only slip and fall but never actually be taken down, it still would be a good idea to have, some falling and get up techniques. So anyway, that kind of long throat clearing notwithstanding, in WT, Siva Learning did put some falling techniques in there. Some like a sit fall if you get thrown. If there's some momentum when you fall down, how to roll forward, how to roll backwards. Basically, the idea is you kind of turn into, he would talk about turning into like a cooked shrimp.
Okay.
And when you go to the ground, unlike doing like a judo style break fall where you use your hand to break the fall, which works great when you have a mat or tatami mat, but maybe not the
on
best
concrete,
if it's
no.
on concrete, right? Although, I mean, is there a great falling method to fall
No.
on concrete? No. I mean, you're falling, right? It's just a matter of how do we minimize the damage when we fall to the ground, and how do we hopefully land in a position where we can very quickly get into, it's not a favorable position if you're on the ground and the other person's standing, or certainly if the guy throws you down and then is trying to get on top of you.
Yeah.
But you have to be able to do something. All right. So we're not talking about, oh, if you just do this, you're going to be fine. It's like we have to take lemons and make lemonade, right? So Sifu Learning taught like kind of a falling method where the moment you fall, you're basically kind of almost up kicking your opponent. Not because you necessarily want to, I mean, if you catch that golden up kick like Henzo Gracie versus Oleg Taktarov, and you can knock the guy down, like Henzo fell down and Oleg rushed him and he gave him an up kick and knocked him out, right? That's kind of like the thing that everyone, a traditional martial artist imagines, right? But while it could happen, it's like everything has to line up in that Venn diagram
you
for
want
that
it
to work,
happen,
right?
and
Yeah,
how it actually
happens. Right? It's not always the same thing. But if you fall down in Learning Wing Chun, you are now at least putting up a leg and you're trying to square up. So in kind of grapplers terms, you're creating a frame between you and your opponent. Because if you don't have that frame when you fall down, your opponent can get on top of you. And once they're body to body on you, side mount or full mount or whatever it is, now you're going to have to know something. And that fight becomes increasingly more difficult because you just gave up dominant position. Whereas if you fall down and you fall in a way where you hopefully protect yourself from any major permanent injury from landing, you tuck your chin in so you're not slamming the back of your head on the concrete, and you put some kind of up kick or some kind of body kick so you could square up and get some kicks in there, get some framing in there, hopefully either kick the guy and back up and get some space, or if the guy gets on top of you, you can, have some kind of frame where you can, roll him off or something. So yeah, it might be a good idea to have that, even if you just fell and you had a way of rolling and standing back up in a way that looked somewhat dignified in the fight. I think this is a good thing. I know from photos in the Learning gym that there were photos of his guys like wearing full contact gear in the 60s.
Yeah.
And one guy's on the ground doing the up kick to keep the other guy off. So clearly Sifu Learning was already teaching some kind of like fall and up kick in the 60s, meaning in the time when Yip Man was still alive. All right. Because it just seems like if you actually put on gear and you spar back and forth, falling down, getting tripped, especially if you're using Wing Chun sweeps and things like that, is something that can happen. So it only makes sense. If Wing Chun did not have a break fall or a sit fall or some way of managing that, it would need to be added to at some point, even if the idea was just to keep you safe in training. Even if in fighting you're never going to get taken down, although we know in fighting you can get taken down. even if it was just a safety thing. So Sifu Learning kind of created these sit, fall, and roll, and like the falling leaf roll and the get-ups and stuff. I've added a couple little things from my training with jiu-jitsu guys and in Europe, like what the WT guys taught the SWAT teams was like a little bit different. And so I've, from input from Magno, from some of my European training, I've opted to do kind of a more modern tactical getup, although I still teach Sifu Learning's handless getup. But I contextualize it for specific situations. Sifu Learning's getup doesn't use the hands. So you have to be able to get up while still having your hands in front of you, because according to Sifu Learning, if you're using your hands to get up, there's nothing protecting your face. Total
Not at
valid criticism, right? But the problem is that if your only method is to roll forward and your opponent's standing in front of you, you're going to roll forward into a knee or a kick. So there needs to be a way that we can get up going backwards. We can create framing. We can create space. But there is a context for Sifu Learning's handless getup, which is why I still teach it. It's kind of beyond the scope of a podcast, but I still retain it. So I teach Sifu Learning's methods, which he clearly has added and refined since the 60s, along with a couple minor updates from my training with Magno and in Europe as well, that I think are useful. And I think every Wing Chun school, whether it's WT, where we have our own methods, and hopefully if you're a WT practitioner, you've learned the sit, fall, and roll and all that kind of stuff. So at the very least, you have that. But if you're from a lineage outside of it, you should learn some kind of break, fall, roll, and get up. So some method of falling down, and then some method of kind of reclaiming the center while you're on the ground, or framing, or being able to keep the person off of you. And you need a method to get off the ground in a way where you're both protected and you can get up and get into a fighting position when you get up.
Something.
You need those three things, I think, in order for your Wing Chun style to be complete. And that's all I got to say about that. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Kung Fu Genius. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the Kung Fu Genius. Hit that bell for notifications. Support us on Patreon or here on YouTube. All that info is in the description below. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.
Word is I'm a kung fu genius. Technique speaks for me, not lineage. Forget Jet Li, cause I'm the one. Many call me seafood, but to you I'm Seagung. And I produce masters. You surpassed us. Your kung fu stiffer than corpse and caskets. City Wing Chun is the house I built. Violate the gate and your blood gets spilled. Alex, Richter, always the victor.
All right, we're recording. You can hear everything. Testes, testes. 1, 2, 3. Spectacles, testicles, watch, and wallet. And
He threw the hookup.
Yeah, so it was pretty cool. It was great. Had a great time.
What's
and,
the name of this restaurant?
I don't remember. Edit all this out. This is totally unimportant. All right. So for as little as $5 a month, you can support your favorite Kung Fu podcast out of New York with the most manliest of co-hosts. And higher levels of or higher tiers of support get Try not to laugh too much when I'm in the middle of the set, yeah. Otherwise, it kind of fucks me up a little bit. Right? All right, you gotta hold it in when we're doing the business end. All right.
All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be answering a question from the Patreon. Lots of gems, lots of
Yeah, man. But you had the energy
Yeah.
of a half dead fly on that one, man.
Yeah.
Let's get the
Hi,
energy up.
everyone. It's, today we're gonna squat on the. Wait, no shit. Geez.
Okay. All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be answering a question from the Patreon. Answering a question.
Questions.
Patreon. All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu... what was that?
No one saw that, but
No.
I can tell you that was
They heard it.
perfectly.
They heard
That
it.
was perfectly in time.
All right, peeps. On today's episode of the Kung Fu Genius, the genius will be answering questions from the Patreon. Lots of gems, lots of doing squats while you're in the fight, lots of, if you do your Sunum Tao all the time, no one can ever take you down. Let's get to it. Ah, no!